Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. And isn't it a bully day? I am especially gratified to be here in Stewart House. Philip Stewart and I were grand friends, and I spent many a wonderful day here in this house preparing for hunting trips, as well as getting sage advice from Mr. Stewart. He bought this house in 1904, but even before that I knew Mr. Stewart quite well, and I knew Colorado College because he was a coach at Colorado College from 1900 on, and I participated in some of the events when I was here. We had another house at the time, and we would mount hunting trips from this abode and his other house, and I had quite a pleasant time here in Colorado Springs. I spent a great many times here. In 1900, I came here 4 times. I had a reunion of the Rough Riders down at the Antlers Hotel, which was a grand affair. I stayed with Mr. Stewart at his other house, as well as out at the Cliff House in Manitou. I came here in 1900 and I wrote a 2-page document with Phil Stewart over my shoulder, urging me on, that went into the Century Chest that was opened again, I believe, or would be opened in 2000. I had a grand time writing that, and I had a grand time here. In 1901, September 5th to be exact, I was at Philip Stewart's house. We were preparing for a hunting trip in Montana. And we had just gone through all of our gear before that trip, and we left on a train that very night. September 6th, at the Pan American Exposition, Mr. McKinley was shot by an assassin, by a disgruntled anarchist. Now, personally, I've never met a gruntled anarchist, but he was shot anyway and mortally wounded. But we'd managed to make Montana with the Greyhounds, and the Secret Service came to fetch us. And we were found, and I was urged to go home. So I went back to Oyster Bay to await, and once I reached Oyster Bay, I received the news that Mr. McKinley had taken a turn for the better, and I should not be worried, but that I should stay on hand just in case. And it was the 17th of September when Mr. McKinley expired, and I became what the Republican Party worst memory and worst desires was. That would become the President of the United States. For you see, I was not a popular Republican. And I was even less popular in the Democratic Party, because I was willing to say those words and speak those thoughts that needed to be said about what was wrong in this country. I was a wild card. I was called a cowboy president. I was called the accidental president. I was called the oh my God president. But I was called the president, and I reacted accordingly. But we're getting ahead of my story a bit, because I took over Mr. McKinley's tour, and I promised the audience at my inauguration that I would only seek but 2 tours as president. 2 administrations they would suffer with me. For I believe that no politician should take a job for more than 2 terms. 1, to make his legislative agenda, lay it out and get it passed. And the second one is to defend it. Because without defense of your policies, they will not go far, as I found later on with Mr. Taft. But I determined that I would only serve as 2 terms. Mr. McKinley's term would be my first, and I would run for 1 more term. I have never regretted that decision, but every day of my life since, because I did not have a first term. I had Mr. McKinley's term. I did not have one that I could promote my own agenda. So I needed to have another term, and I ran for president again in 1912 on my own plan. But I digress. You need to know where I came from and what I'm doing here, and how I became the man that I am. The man you see in front of you this morning is approaching his 60th birthday. I am proud of that because my father died at 49. But as I approach my 60th birthday, I have the luxury of looking back across my life and taking pride in it, because I have done everything I have set to do, I have said everything that needs to be said, and I intend to do more of it as it comes about. I'm not in good health. I have malaria that has never healed. I have a wound in my lower leg that I got on the river Rio Roosevelt, or otherwise known as the River of Doubt. I almost died on that trip, and I have an infection that never healed. But I'm more than willing to get involved. And in 1917, when we were about to go to war, and Mr. Wilson finally got us into that war, much over my protestations, I was willing to recreate the Rough Riders and go over and show the French how to properly charge. Mr. Wilson, in his wisdom, denied me that, nor do I think that I would have been of sound body to do that. But the mind was willing, and I was willing to express it and do it. But more than that, as I approach my 60th birthday, I am not exactly mentally sound. See, all of my children, my male children, went into the service in the war. Theodore Jr. is in the infantry. Kermit Kermit went to the Navy. And my other two boys, Archie and, I'm pulling up a dry moment here, went to the Army Air Corps. They both were shot down on the same day. Unfortunately, my son Archie died in the crash. And I have never fully recovered from that mental anguish. For you see, one of the things that the Roosevelts never talked about was how to take on the burdens of grief. We were told to march on. We were told to do the right thing. We were told to cry, get over it, and march down the road, which is what I did for most of my life. So I am not in as great shape as I was during my presidency, and I beg your pardon on that. I also carry a bullet in my left breast. Now again, I would call him a disgruntled anarchist, except he was not an anarchist. He just didn't like me. He was a shopkeeper from Milwaukee and decided that I was not to be president in 1912. And as I left my hotel to go to Congress Hall in Milwaukee, he stepped up with a .32 caliber gun and shot me through the worst place a politician could be shot, through my speech. For you see, in my left breast pocket, not only did I have a 75-page speech folded in half, I had my steel glasses case. The bullet penetrated the speech, the glasses case went under the skin and rested next to my rib cage. It bled profusely, but it did no internal damage. I stuck a handkerchief in it, I upbraided the man, and I turned him over to the constabulary, and I went on to Congress Hall, where I proceeded to apologize to them for the bloody handkerchief. I pulled out my 75-page blood-soaked speech and dropped it on the floor in front of me. I told them that I would not be as long-winded as I normally am. And I wasn't. I only gave them 90 minutes. So I promise not to be that long with you. But as I look back upon my life, I have come a long distance. When I was born in 1858, it was the time of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, time of great turmoil in this country. Whether Kansas would come into the Union, slave or free. Now, I was an infant. I didn't know what was happening at the time. But I wondered why my father and mother later on and during the war were so concerned about what was happening. I was a sickly child. I was born with asthma, intractable asthma. In New York City, I found that I was also allergic to coal dust and coal smoke. And in New York City in the 1850s, all of the furnaces were fed by coal dust and coal smoke. I couldn't breathe half the time. Some of my earliest memories when I was 1 and 2 and 3 is my father driving the 2-horse carriage through Central Park, breakneck speed, with me being supported by my mother in the front so that air could be forced into my lungs and so that I could breathe. The smell of eucalyptus was throughout the house. Now, there were 2 forms of asthma treatment available at the time, eucalyptus and strong coffee, or eucalyptus, brandy, honey, and lemon rind. I did not like the taste of brandy, although my brother Elliot did. I took to the coffee. And it seemed to ease the bronchial spasms for me. During my presidency, I was known to drink 1.5 gallons a day. I would get up at 4 in the morning and I'd go to bed at 10:30 at night. I'd read 2 books in the morning and I would be fit for duty and go on, because I had gotten used to coffee early on in my life. Being an asthmatic in New York City, I suffered and I was homeschooled by my mother and my father. In the summertime, we'd go to a camp up in Oyster Bay where my health would regain because there were no coal smoke up there. There was open land and it was next to the ocean and it was humidified with salt air, and my lungs relaxed and I was able to run and jump with the rest of my brothers, only to return to New York City that fall, to fall back into the routine. By the time I was 14, I was ready to do more. I wanted to do more. My mother had taught me about all the fine arts. She had taught me about the appreciation of art history and art. She taught me the appreciation of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey. She had taught me about how to appreciate Latin and Greek. She didn't speak them, but she made sure I had a tutor that I would understand them. But by the time I was 14, 15, I still couldn't run and jump with the rest of my brothers and sisters. So I went to my father and I said, "Father, what can I do? I want to be a normal son." And he said, "Theodore, you have a mind that will take you far in this world, but you do not have a body that will cross the threshold to get you there. I will tell you the secret to life as I know it and what has made me the man that I am." He said, "If you live by these tenets, you will have a long and happy life." He said, "You and you alone are responsible for your life. You and you alone make those choices that make a life worth living. You and you alone create your failures or your successes. And I would hope that you would make up your mind to make those successes. But until you make up your mind to do anything, absolutely nothing will happen." He said, "There are people that can help you. There are people that can hinder you. But until you make your mind up to do something, nothing will happen. So what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to run and jump." He said, "I can help you." We had a small porch off the second floor bedroom of my brother Elliot and I. He turned it into a gymnasium. We had Indian clubs. We had medicine balls. We had a punching bag. And I was getting ready for Harvard. I was being tutored on one hand with Greek and mathematics and everything else that I needed for Harvard. And on the other hand, I was punching a punching bag, and we had a rowing machine on the floor that was made out of solid mahogany, brass fittings, and springs made out of iron. It weighed 600 pounds. And I would try to do that, and I was making progress, but not as fast as I wanted. So I said, "Father, can you help me some more?" And he brought in a pugilist, a boxer, a bare-knuckles boxer to train me. They were the finest athletes of their kind because they had to toe the line 15 rounds in order to get paid. So he brought in a boxer to train me, and we worked out on the body bag. We worked out on the punching bag. We jumped rope until I could not hardly stand, and I rowed 6 hours a day. By the time I was ready for Harvard, it wasn't quite ready for me. But I went anyway, took my exams, and was accepted. I was a legacy student because my father, Theodore, was a graduate. But I went in and I found the college classes quite easy compared to what my parents had put me through. So I went out for something else, and I decided I need to have some intramural sports. So I went out for the boxing team. Well, I walked in, all 5'8" of myself and 152 pounds, and spindly legs, and I said, "I want to be a boxer." And they looked me up and down, and they said, "No, no, 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 no. You will never do." And I said, "Well, can I at least have a tryout? Do you have a person that I can spar with?" And they brought out their 160-pound champion. And 3 rounds later, he was on the floor and I was on the boxing team. Likewise, in the spring, I went out for the rowing team, and I went out to the coach and the head coxswain, and I said, "I would like to be on the rowing team." And they looked at my legs and they said, "No, no, 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 no. You will never do. Your legs are too spindly." And I said, "Would you give me a one-man boat, and I'll go out on the Charles River and I'll show you what I can do." Now remember, I was trained on a 600-pound mahogany and brass rowing machine. And I went out there, and by the time I left Harvard, I was a coxswain on an 8-man crew. And I lettered in both. I found the studies still easy, and I went along through my sophomore year. My father, who was ill during that time, passed on from stomach cancer. I lost one of my mentors, one of my greatest inspirations. The only man I truly feared, and not because I was afraid of him, but I was afraid to disappoint him. And the only man I truly adored. But as Roosevelt's, I took up the pain. I cried a little bit. I looked at my inheritance, and I said, I need to invest some of it. And so I went back to school, and a friend of mine was headed out to the Dakota territories. He was going to buy a dude ranch, and I asked him what a dude ranch was. And he asked me he said, "Well, go look in a mirror and you'll find one." And I realized that it was somebody from the East that had never ridden on a real pony with a real saddle, that had no idea how to herd horses, that had no idea how to shoot a gun from a saddle, and was at lost in the great wide open spaces. So I went out with him to the Dakota territories, and he bought a 10,000-acre ranch. And when I got to the Dakota territories, to the Badlands, and I looked at the wide open spaces that are very similar to what is here in Colorado, and I looked at the Badlands, and I looked at the prairie, and I looked at the animals. The buffalo were running everywhere. The antelope were in herds of hundreds and thousands. And I fell in love with that. And I bought 2 ranches, the Elkhorn and the Medora, and in the Medora, and the Maltese Cross. And I fell in love with that. And I went back to college. I put my cattle holdings in a manager. Went back to my junior year and successfully completed that. And in my senior year, I got a report that I had made some money on cattle. But I had I had a friend of mine in college named Stephen Lee, and Stephen took me home one night to have dinner with his family. The Lee family was upstanding, and they were in Back Bay, Boston, Chestnut Hill. And I walked into the household. Mr. Lee, the father, had known my father in business. And as I walked through the door, I was dumbstruck by what I saw. For across the room was a delightful, blonde, 5'2", green-eyed beauty that I saw. Her name was Alice. The first time I saw her, I turned to my friend Stephen and I said, "I'm going to marry that woman." And he just laughed and turned to me and said, "Well, get in line. She's my sister. And every man jack in Boston is after her. You are going to have to put in extra effort." And I remembered what my father said. Once you make up your mind to do something, carry it forward to your best degree and make it happen. So I made Stephen a little closer friend. I went to Stephen's father and I said, you knew my father in business. I lost him 2 years ago, and I need to have a mentor to help me through the time after I graduate. Can I come and see you as that mentor? And he said, "My boy, consider yourself part of the family. You can come and talk to me anytime you would like." And I said, "Thank you, sir, I will do that." And I went to Alice's mother, and I complimented her on the way she set her table. And I brought her flowers, and I said, you really do set a wonderful table." And she said, "I will have you here all the time if you'd like." And through those relationships, I managed to sit at the right hand of the fair Alice at every family dinner, at every celebration, and at every holiday. And on Valentine's Day of 1880, just before I was to graduate, I turned to Alice at a Sunday dinner and I said, "Alice, have you ever entertained the idea of marrying me?" And she said, "Why, Theodore, I didn't think I had a choice. You have worn me down." And it was June of that year when I graduated, we were married, and we went off to New York to start our married life. Now, we moved my mother and her sister into the brownstone in New York City with us. And while I did not have to have a job to get my daily bread, if I wanted butter and jam on it, I had to find an occupation. So I went to law school at Columbia for 2 years. And I left almost screaming from the room because it was not anything that I had determined that law should be. It didn't teach you how to administer justice. It didn't teach you anything except how to mitigate, obfuscate, and negotiate your way out of problems, and never come to a proper justice conclusion. I left and I looked around for a job, and I looked to politics. Not because I had any grand ideas that I could do any better than anyone else, but I certainly couldn't do any worse. And I told some friends of mine, and they said, "Why would you want an occupation in such a low-class order like politics?" It was one step up above a streetwalker. And one friend actually told me, he said, "In order for you to get into a political party, you'd have to use a jimmy or a crowbar." But I made application, and I had a friend go and speak for me in the Republican Club on the 127th District of New York. Now, in those days, you had to have someone sponsor you, and you had to go make a speech. And then they had a jury of 12 that had 2 balls in their hand, one black one and one white one. One black ball, and you were denied access to the Republican Party for life. And so I made my choice. They looked at me, and they gave me all white balls in the ballot box. And I became a Republican for life. The only thing that could get you kicked out of the Republican Club was conviction of murder, and serving a sentence, or high crimes and misdemeanors, which has always been a mystery to politicians. So I went off, and I was making a living as a columnist for the New York Times, and I was writing an expose on the judges and the police department at the time, because the judges were selling their decisions to make their money. Otherwise, they got paid a pittance. The police department got paid so little that they had no opportunity to have a family and make it survive. And so bribery and corruption was rampant in the justice system. And I was writing articles for the New York Times about that. Now I was even writing articles about Republican judges. Can you imagine that? And they had a meeting in the Republican Club headquarters. And it was the same place that I went to be voted in. And if you ever think of a political campaign being run on a second floor room above a saloon with brandy and thick smoke of some cigars as being a political club, you're absolutely right. That's what the Republican Club was, that's what the Democrat Club was, and they ran it as a single command dictatorship by a man by the name of Jim Pratt. Now I was a member for life, remember? And they said they were having a discussion about me, and from the back of the house came a small voice saying, "What are we going to do with Theodore?" And they said, "What are we going to do with him? We can't drive him out of the party. He hasn't killed anybody. And we have no idea what crimes he's committed." And another small voice from the other side said, "Well, we have a junior assemblyman job in Albany. We can run him for that. He'll be a backbencher, and we will never hear from him again." And so they took a vote, and it was unanimous. They ran me for assemblyman from the 127th district. I was elected with their blessing and with their money. And I went up for the first year as a one-year term, which I agree with, by the way. And I went up and I sat in the back bench and I watched what was going on. I watched the relationships. I watched how things were being done. I made friends of other junior assemblymen. And I came home and I said, "I'd like to run again. Is that possible?" And they said, "Certainly you can." And so I ran, and I got, with their support, I was reelected. And I went back, but the 16 of us that were in the backbenchers, we now were sophomores. We did not have to have somebody else sponsor our bills. And we started sponsoring bills making corruption in the judiciary a statewide illegal statement. We made it possible for the police department to start paying their people more to eliminate corruption, and making corruption in the judiciary and in the police departments illegal for the first time in New York history. Now, this did not make me friends in New York City. I came back, and Alice and I were expecting a child. And I was overjoyed at being a parent. And she was not doing well. She had some problems. But I came back and I asked her, "Can I run for another term?" And she said, "Certainly you may." And I went down and talked to the Republicans. By this time, they'd had enough of me. And they said, "Theodore, you may run if you want to, but you're doing it without party support." And so I said, "Fine, I'll run on my own." And I ran on my own as an independent. And lo and behold, I was elected by the largest majority of any legislator in New York's history, even to your day. And I went back up. Alice was still, she was bedridden at the time, and my mother had contracted typhoid fever from her work with the poor. And she was not doing well. She was in bed in the brownstone. And I asked the doctors, I said, "Is everything going to be fine?" And they assured me that anything could happen, but they were both on an upswing, and that I could be home in a 5-hour train ride from Albany, and not to worry, but I should go about my duties. And Alice dismissed me to go back up to Albany, and this was on the 12th of February. I kissed her goodbye, and I went up to Albany, and I started work again, only to be summoned home. So the next day, on the 13th, I took a train home to find Alice doing worse, and my mother taking a turn for the worse with typhoid. And on Valentine's Day of 1884, the two most important women in my life died. My mother in the morning, and my dear Alice that afternoon. I did not know what to do. I had never been schooled in grief. I had no idea how to handle myself, much less an infant daughter, who we called Alice. I was lost in my own thoughts. And I put my daughter, Alice, into my sister Anna's hands. And we had just signed the contracts to build Sagamore Hill. And I said, when it's built, take her up there and live. And I went back to Albany and resigned my post. I had a small office with the National Republican Convention for presidency that year, and went to Chicago and took care of that. But I went out to my ranches in North Dakota, out to the Elkhorn and the Maltese Cross. Absolutely certain I would never see politics again, and I would never be the same, because my heart was broken and I had no idea how to mend it. And so I went out west instinctively knowing that the West would heal me. And I started riding a horse. Now, I was not your normal cowboy. Not me, no. I had an elk hide leather jacket with beaded roses in the front, back, and on the sleeves. And it had fringe underneath the arms. I was a dashing sort. And I had a hat on my head roughly resembling that of a Mississippi riverboat gambler. And I had gauntlets that came up to the elbows with the same roses embedded on the gauntlets. I made a striking pose compared to the jeans wearing dirty cowboy shirt wearing cowboys I was riding with. They began instantly to ride me. They called me Four Eyes. They called me Dude. They called me things I would never repeat in mixed company. Every night it was the same thing. They would ride me with both spurs. And I took it because I had no idea where I was or who I was. I let them exploit me, and I let them do the things that they had to do. And I let them do the things they had to do for my own benefit. Because until I made up my mind to change my circumstances, nothing could happen. And I wasn't in a sight to change my mind. For a year this went on. And finally, after 16 months, I'd had enough. And we were on a roundup down on the lower bend of the Missouri River. And they had their spurs on, and they were digging them into my sides left and right. And this one cowboy, for the sake of argument, I will call him Montana Slim. He was into me with both spurs, and I stood up in front of him, and I took a step forward, and I said, "Shut up!" And Montana Slim got up and up and up. 6'4" of wiry cowboy. And I was ready to take him on. And he looked at me and he started to laugh. And it wasn't a laugh of mockery. It was a laugh at the situation, because I had finally shown my stuff. I had finally made up my mind to stand my ground and to get better. He started to laugh, and the rest of the cowboys started to laugh. Then I started to laugh, and I realized something, that my father's words were still in my ears, that until you change your circumstances, nothing will happen. And I went on about my business, and I became much better at what I was doing. So much so that when the spring thaw came that year of 1888, I went down to the river to get my boat to cross back over to my ranch camp, and my boat was stolen. Somebody had taken it, and I wasn't about to have that. So I had my friends, we created another boat. We built another boat right there. And we went down the river, tracking down my boat thieves. When I got down to the next town, down below Medora, there was my boat on the water, and there were the three ne'er-do-wells drinking beside it. After a bit of fisticuffs, which I pummeled them, we took them to the sheriff, and they were convicted of thievery. And I realized that I was wasting my time out in the West, that I'd regained my composure, that I had regained what I had lost. And in 1888, I returned to New York City. And I looked around for something to do, and I ran for mayor that year. I had successes as an assemblyman, and I lost that election. But in doing so, I made an acquaintance of my fiance from before I went to school, Edith Carroll. And Edith and I were a team before I went to college. What broke us up, I have no idea. But we reintroduced ourselves, and we were married that year, and it started a fine relationship that carried me into the presidency, with 5 children, by the way. We went off, our honeymoon was a grand tour of Europe, and we got back, and I decided to look at the situation again, not to necessarily get into politics directly, but to go and do some support. So I supported Mr. Harrison in his election, and when he got elected, he made me one of the 3 civil service commissioners. The other 2 civil service commissioners did not want to stay in the office. One liked to ride his polo ponies back in New England, and he was never there. The other one liked the nightlife in Washington so much, he was hungover most of the time. I made the difference. We proposed legislation protecting the civil servants. We proposed a lot of changes in that civil service law, because up to that time frame when the administration changed, everyone from top to bottom in the government changed, whether you're a janitor or whether you were a top secretary. If you were of a different party, you got swept out. The corporate memory of the United States was disappearing every 4 to 8 years. We changed that. Now, those of you that visited the Department of Motor Vehicles lately might take that as I should have left it alone, but we made that change. And after Mr. Harrison had enough of me, and I did of him, I left to become police commissioner of New York City. First thing I did was walk the streets for the first 2 months, seeing how the police department was still corrupt. When I walked into the assembly that first day as police commissioner that they knew of me, many of them recognized me from my midnight walks. First thing I did was fire half of the police department. I put the other half on notice that if they did not clean up their act, they would not be around. And I trained them in firearms for the very first time. They were unarmed except for a truncheon. I gave them 38 caliber Smith & Wessons, and I made them proficient. I made them read for the first time in the history of the New York Police Department. They had to read and write the laws that they were to enforce. When I left to go support Mr. McKinley in 1896, the Sûreté and Scotland Yard had come over to the United States and done a study on my methods and took them back to their own forces and implemented the changes. I supported Mr. McKinley, and when he was elected, he made me one of the best job offers I ever had, the Undersecretary of the Navy. Now, I was the Undersecretary, I wasn't the Secretary, but the Secretary was a hypochondriac. And every morning I came in and made query of his health, and he would look at me and, is there something wrong? And I said, well, no, you just look a little red. And he would go take his temperature, and then I would say, shouldn't you sit down, sir? And he would go home for a week, leaving me to run the Navy Department. I began working weekends because things happen on the weekends. They just don't happen Monday through Friday. I began working on the weekends, and that's when Commodore Dewey's request came in, and he said, what do I do if the Spanish attack me at Manila? And I sent back the message on Sunday afternoon, take Manila at all costs. The war broke out. Now, whatever you think about my friend William Randolph Hearst and his journalism, the battleship Maine was dispatched to Havana Harbor on our business, and it was blown up. And it was up to us to avenge it, and I wanted to do that. And Mr. McKinley was at first slow to respond. And when he finally did declare war, I petitioned him for release of my job so that I could form the 1st Volunteer Cavalry. And he first turned me down, and I said, it doesn't matter, I'll quit anyway. And he said, I couldn't stop you if I wanted to. So I put out the hue and cry, and 70% of my force came from the West, from cowboys, from people that knew of me or knew about me, but didn't necessarily know me. 30% were dandies from New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, and the rest. And they came down and we formed a battalion called the 1st Volunteer Cavalry. I like that name. The newspapers dubbed them the Rough Riders, and I hated it. I hated it. But my lieutenants came to me and they said, the men love it. It's exactly what they want to do. They want to go down to Cuba and they want to ride roughshod over the Spanish. It is our time to do that. And I thought for another moment, they proved me wrong. Therefore, I have to change my thought pattern. And I changed it right then, and the Rough Riders it was. Although I still prefer the 1st Volunteer Cavalry. We went down to Cuba and our medal was tested. We won, and I was nominated for a Congressional Medal of Honor. It was stopped by the War Department because when I came back after our period of quarantine, I petitioned the War Department and the Department of the Army for better treatment of our soldiers and better treatment of our wounded. And I made myself such a spectacle with them that the Department of War stopped my Congressional Medal of Honor until President Clinton awarded it to me posthumously. I went on from there, and I was the most popular man in the country at the time. The press made a big deal of San Juan Hill. It's wrong. San Juan Heights and Kettle Hill. There were two of them. The press didn't always get it right, but I didn't care. I ran for governor of New York and became a governor. And in 1900, I was willing to go back and support Mr. McKinley for his run at the presidency for a second term. And I told him as much. For I did not want the presidency in 1904, or 1900. I wanted the presidency in 1904. And so I went to the convention that year firmly in mind to support Mr. McKinley, stay the governor of New York, where I could make a difference. But again, there's a meeting of Mark Hanna, Jim Pratt in a small smoke-filled room where somebody says, "What do we do with Theodore?" And another small voice in the back of the room said, "We'll run him for vice president and we will never hear from him again." I walked into the convention that day to make a speech supporting Mr. McKinley, and instead I got the hue and cry from the entire audience. Theodore for vice president, Theodore for vice president, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. They took a voice-only vote, and not one nay was heard in that hall. And I became vice president, to be tucked away as all vice presidents are. Mr. McKinley and I ran the next year, and we won. When I was young, a child, my sisters Anna and Corinne, now Anna we called Bammy for reason. Anna and Corinne could not pronounce Theodore. They couldn't even pronounce Ted. Whenever they would call me T-Dye. And T-Dye eventually became Teddy. And Teddy, in my mind, is always a diminutive, something that I hated to be called, because it made me feel like a child again, and I did not like that. So whenever people would call me Teddy, I would grimace and I'd say, "Well, that's them." I would correct them. My familiars always called me TR, or Theodore. Later in life, they called me Colonel or Mr. President. And it wasn't until 1906 that I really appreciated the name Teddy. And that is because the teddy bear had come into popularity. Now, depending upon where and what you want to believe, it could have happened in 1901 at the Hotel Colorado, or it could have happened like it actually did in 1902 in the Mississippi, Louisiana Delta country. I went down there as president because they were having a terrific drought in the Delta. The rivers were drying up and going down to nothing, and they were having a terrible problem, and the governor of Louisiana wanted me to come down there to see what could be done, either by the military or perhaps by the federal government. We had no capacity to do anything like that, but I went down anyway because he told me that the black bears of the Delta were extraordinarily ferocious and that they needed to be culled out. Any excuse for a hunting trip is what I thought. And so I went down there with all my presidential entourage, because by this time I had learned that the press could be both your friend and your enemy. And I kept both of them very close. So I went down to the Mississippi Delta country, and we did 7 days, and not a black bear could be seen. The corn had dried up, the rivers were flowing like creeks, and there was just nothing but devastation as far as the eye could see. And I was getting ready on the morning of the 7th day to return to Washington unhunted. And the morning of the 7th day, we got up and we were having breakfast when the aide to the Louisiana governor came running into camp saying, Mr. President, we have your bear for you to shoot." And I grabbed my .45-70 Winchester and away we went. Put my hat on and away we went. I had my campaign hat with one side of it flopped up like I did during the Spanish War. And we walked into this clearing, and what did we find but a yearling bear, half clubbed to death, chained to a tree. Now, all the governor's aide knew is that I wanted to shoot a bear. He didn't realize that I'm a hunter, not a killer. I wanted to hunt the bear on his terms. When a man goes up against a ferocious wild animal, it tests the mettle of the man, not to kill the bear. I wanted to hunt. I did not want to kill. The press corps followed me right behind me, and I turned my back on the bear and I said, I shall not shoot this bear. The country needs this bear more than I. And it is unfair of me to hunt, to call this a hunt. And I walked away. I sent one of my aides back to dispatch the bear because he was more dead than alive to begin with. And so a man in the press corps named Berryman was a political cartoonist. 2 weeks later, a cartoon comes out in the Washington Post. And it's a single cell cartoon. And it shows me in all of my hunting finery with my gun and my teeth sticking out and in my hat. And there is this cute, cuddly bear chained to a tree with the governor's aide standing next to it. Now, a simple caption was what he had underneath it. But that simple caption caused more turmoil in my administration than anything else that could have happened. Because that caption read, Teddy draws the line in Mississippi. Simple caption, tells you exactly what I did. I didn't want to hunt the bear. Well, the people that wanted me to do something about the poll taxes and about the black vote in Mississippi wanted me to do something, and I was doing nothing. The people that didn't want me to do anything, that wanted me to leave the status quo, were afraid I was going to do something. All of them wrote into the White House. All of them wrote their congressmen and their senators. You better not touch Mississippi. Created such a fervor, but there wasn't one thing the government could do about voting rights within a state. That is not the purview of the government. That is the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which allows interstate to control their prosperity. I wasn't about to do anything about it. There was nothing I could do. But that one political cartoon spun off a lot, and every time Mr. Berryman was happy with me, I became a cute, cuddly, soft cinnamon bear. When he was mad at me, I became a mean, ugly, black grizzly bear. And I realized that I could use this. And so when I wanted to have my position displayed in artistic format, I would leak to Mr. Berryman what my position was. And he would make a cartoon about it. And the series of the bear cartoons, the Theodore Roosevelt bear cartoons, started flowing in 1904. And in 1906, there was a toy convention in New York City where a man by the name of Morris Misham from the Ideal Toy Company and a woman by the name of Marie Stife were attending the conference on toys. And they both had produced a line of soft, cuddly toys. And they were anticipating doing a teddy, a bear, in that line. And when they saw the cartoons and saw the history of them and the popularity that had come about by what I had done, they both wrote and asked permission to use my name Teddy associated with their new, cute, cuddly bear. Now, what politician could turn that down? I wrote back immediately and said, of course you can do that, because every politician wants his name forevermore associated with a child's cute, cuddly toy. Now, had I had my businessman's costume on, I would have trademarked my name and made some money out of it, but as such, I made not a dollar. But the teddy bear is still being bought, still being told, and still has its popularity, and so do I. Now, if you believe the Hotel Colorado, as well as the Des Moines Hotel in Des Moines, Iowa, and there is a third hotel down in Georgia, that all relate to the same thing. Now, the people at the Hotel Colorado managed to put their date of 1901 on their story. They said that after a disappointing bear hunt, I came back to the hotel and a chambermaid made a teddy bear out of surplus cloth, putting it on my bed so that I would have something to solace my hunter's brow. But the story didn't happen until 1902. So at least they had the presence of mind to predate it, so you can't say it's not true. And I would not cancel out any story about me that leads to my memorability in later generations. So that's how I became known for the teddy bear, and I accept after that the name Teddy with pride, but only after 1906. So I digress, but anyway, as I left you before, I became the most unpopular president of the United States. not because of anything I did, but because what they thought I might do. I served Mr. McKinley's first 4 years, and I ran for re-election, and I was re-elected by a large majority of votes against Mr. William Jennings Bryan. Now, in that time, we had a terrific national debt problem. We had $9 billion in gold reserves, and we had a $10 billion debt, largely because of the Spanish War and because of some other exploits that we had done in the 1890s and early 1900s. And we were running on a mix of silver and gold in the monetary system so we could enhance it. And that's why William Jennings Bryan in 1904 reissued the Cross of Gold speech against me. Even that did not help him be elected. I still won by a landslide. In my second term, I put an end to the Russian-Japanese War, and because of that, and because of my negotiation skills at the Treaty of Portsmouth, I was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, accepted in Oslo. I was awarded the Croix de Guerre from the French. I was the first president ever to use telephones in the White House. I was the first president to ever flush a toilet in the White House. Somehow they fit together. But I was the first in a lot of things. I was the first president to ever ride in a motorcade. When we ran Mr. Taft for president, and he won, I proceeded in the motorcade to his inauguration in a 1906 Pierce Arrow. And I bought one just like it for the family use in Oyster Bay. I was the first president to do a lot of things, and I greatly appreciate that. I solved a labor dispute between the anthracite coal miners and the owners. This was in 1902. They went on strike. They had reason to. They were being paid in company script. They were living in company houses. They shopped at company stores, and they worked at company work. And if you wanted to leave, you had to give them 30 days notice, at which point you had no work, you had no money, you had to wait for 30 days to get your script converted to greenbacks. It was involuntary servitude for the coal miners. They went out on strike, and I supported the strike. They weren't about to compromise. The owners on one side, the unions on the other, and they were both intractable in their stands. I brought them together in the White House, and I put them in a room in the West Wing, and I posted a Marine Guard outside, and I said, you will come to a conclusion, or I will, and you will not like it, either one of you. They tried to leave. The Marine Guards turned their guns on them and forced them back in. At the end of 3 days, they came out with a viable solution that allows unions to exist, allowed the management to control their costs, and they both came out relatively happy, but not totally. That was what I saw in my presidency. I was reading the muckrakers about what was happening in the slaughterhouses in Chicago. I was reading about what the robber barons, the trust barons were doing with the railroads, with banks, with coal mines, with everything else. J.P. Morgan headed the banks and the railroads, and he proclaimed that what's good for the railroads is good for the United States. He would cut prices in one area to drive his competition out while raising prices in an area that he controlled. He never saw a dollar less in his profits, but everybody else in those states either suffered under the horrific burden of additional profit, or the competition was driven out of business and he bought them for 10 cents on the dollar. And when he was accomplished in that, he would raise the rates again, and everybody suffered. I found another piece of divinely inspired legislation. And I don't say that offhand. The divinity has given us a lot of things that could only be accomplished with his effort. The Sherman Antitrust Act is one of those. It was passed as a feel-good piece of legislation, just as the National Parks legislation was passed in U.S. Grant's time. It was a piece of feel-good legislation, but allowed people later on to use it for the benefit of all. The Sherman Antitrust Act allowed me to take them to court and break up Standard Oil, break up Carnegie Steel, break up the railroad trust of J.P. Morgan, break up the banks so that there are more competition, allowing more people to get involved, allowing the country to proceed. If that is a populist, if that is a progressive issue, I gladly espouse it. I broke up the banks because we did not need to have a national bank. Every president from George Washington to myself and Mr. Taft had rejected a national bank. Christmas Eve in 1913, Mr. Wilson instituted the Federal Reserve Bank as the national bank of this country, and we've seen where it's led us. I do not intend to impugn Mr. Wilson, even though I think he is an elitist, he's a segregationist, and he has no more bearing of being president than a chair. I left the presidency in Mr. Taft's capable hands. Mr. Taft swore he would carry on my progressive attitudes, both for the country, for national parks, and the national forest. I went off to Africa to leave the country in his hands, so I would not be a burden to him. In 1910, I started receiving letters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and from my constituency begging me to come back and take over because Mr. Taft had gone back into the political side of the arena and allowed Mark Hanna, Jim Pratt, and the Republican Party to tell him what to do and where to spend the resources of this country. I also came back to a huge forest fire, which brings me back to the 1874 Society. I spoke at the 1874 Society when a young man who wrote a book called The Big Burn, Timothy Egan, wrote about the big fire. 30 million acres went up in 1 week in a national forest fire. Western Oregon, Montana, Idaho were consumed. Whole towns were decimated. Railroads were consumed, and the railroad tracks were curled from the force of the fire because Mr. Taft had loosened the regulations on the national forest, had allowed speculation of the timber barons to go in and selectively cut and leaving their trash, had allowed incursions in the national forest land that should not have been allowed. 30 million acres went up in one forest blast, and I realized I had to get into the fight. In April of 1912, I decided to run for president again. I went out and I entered into 12 of the popularity polls of the time, the primary elections. I also entered 18 of the caucuses around the country. I had garnered every election that I was in, the primary election. I had garnered 16 of the 18 caucuses. I took enough delegates to the Republican convention that year to create a second ballot. And on a second ballot, I would have been nominated by the Republican Party. I was met at the door by Jim Pratt and Mark Hanna, and they had already seated a delegation from the states that I had won in violation of the tenets of the convention. But they had found a remote issue under Robert's Rules of Order that allowed that to happen, and my delegation was not seated with votes. They barred me at the door, and I left, and I took the Progressive Party nomination in 1912, and I went on the stump for president. I was leading in October, before that fateful night that I mentioned in the first part, where I came out of my hotel in Milwaukee, and the shopkeeper shot me with a .32 caliber. I was out of the election for a month, and there were rumors spread by both parties that I was a drunk, that I was an alcoholic, and that I had fallen off the wagon and was not to be seen. I lost that election by 10 percentage points. Wilson had 40%, I had 30, Mr. Taft had 19. I went on after the election and I sued those people that spread the rumors of my being an alcoholic, and I won all of my cases and collected retribution from them. And then I went off to the River of Doubt, and I came back fairly much an invalid. I was still active, and I wrote some commentary to the American Democratic Society in New York City in 1918, just before my death. And I wrote these words, and I believe in them today. We are one country. We have but one flag, the American flag, for it is under that we have fought and died for our freedoms. We have but one language, the language of the founding fathers, that they wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Two of those documents that are divinely inspired. For how could those people, slave owners and rebels, create such beautiful documents of we the people in order to form a more perfect union? Those documents are dear to me. And I wrote those at the time. And I said, it is under that we have but one flag, we have but one country, we have but one language. We are a melting pot. And it is through the crucible of education of our immigrants that citizens are born. We are a melting pot. We are not a polyglot society rooming house where you come and stay and leave at your own will, taking the riches you have gained here with you. That is not what we are. And I wrote those and I believe those today. We are not a polyglot rooming house. We have but one language. For what country can exist with multiple languages? It is an impossibility. But it is through the crucible of training that our citizens are developed. And I would like to tip my hat to the 1874 Society. As you heard in Mr. Engellen's beautiful words earlier on, this society puts $1 million into those things that make education happen. It is not the glitz and glamour of supporting professors, but how you make that education available. The dormitories, the grasslands, everything that makes it worthwhile studying. That's what you do. And I tip my hat to you. And I'm glad that there are societies such as yours. I would have joined this society. But in 1874, I was prepping for Harvard with a tutor. And I leave you, I hope I've impressed upon you enough about my father's words. Nothing will happen in your life until you make your mind up to make it happen. And then use your entire intellect, your entire abilities, your entire body to make it happen. And it is not to the man, not to the critic, not to the naysayer, not to the man who tells a brave man how he could have done better, or a doer of deeds how he could have done things different. It is not to that man that belongs the day. It is to the man who is actually in the arena. The man whose face is stained with blood and sweat and tears. It is to that man who belongs the day. For at best he will know the great exaltations of victory, and at worst, only the bittersweet memories of defeat. The naysayer, the coward, the man who says no, will never have any of those experiences because he will never have risked anything. And he will die a cold and lonely death without experiencing life. I thank you very much. I'm open to your questions.